Shadows over Kansas City. Part 3. The Gathering Storm. The fading light of the January evening cast long shadows across the narrow streets of Kansas City. The usual bustle of city life continued, streetcars rattling down the rails, voices drifting from shop fronts, and the occasional bark of a dog, but there was something sharper in the air tonight. It was a feeling Garwood couldn't shake, a tension that hummed in his chest like a taut wire. The usual din of life in the city was present, but Garwood could feel something darker and foreboding. People moved with an urgency that wasn't typical, their hurried steps and nervous glances hinting at the unease rippling through the city. Garwood's steps were steady, but his chest felt heavy with dread. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, and tonight they screamed at him. Violence was coming. He could feel it in his bones and taste it on the icy wind. Blood would be shed tonight. He scanned the streets as he walked, his boots crunching against the frozen pavement. His instincts were screaming at him to stay vigilant, to prepare for what was ahead. Something was coming. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a weight he'd carried on nights like this before. Violence hung in the air like an electric charge, waiting for the spark that would ignite it. As he approached the apartment building, Garwood took a detour to the side alley, slipping into a secret passage that allowed him to enter unnoticed. Thaddeus might be waiting for him, and experience had taught him to be cautious. The hidden stairs creaked under his weight, the sound muffled by the oppressive quiet of the building. Inside the apartment, Garwood took a moment to rub his hands together to chase away the cold. He had just started to gather his things for the night's work when a sharp knock at the door shattered the stillness. With a sigh, he moved to answer it, already anticipating the confrontation to come. Thaddeus Gerard stood in the hallway, his face flushed with frustration. The young man's disheveled hair and clenched fists betrayed his anger before he even spoke. "You didn't tell me anything last time," Thaddeus said, stepping into the apartment uninvited. His voice was taut, carrying the weight of his growing impatience. "You promised me answers about Olivia." Garwood sighed, closing the door behind him. "Sit," he ordered, motioning to a chair by the window. His tone was sharp, his patience already frayed by the boy's persistence. Thaddeus obeyed reluctantly, sinking into the chair with his arms crossed. "I deserve to know where she is," he muttered, his defiance bubbling just beneath the surface. Garwood leaned against the table, his arms folded. "What you deserve isn't the issue. Olivia is in danger. Every decision I've made has been to keep her safe. That's the priority." Before Thaddeus could respond, a knock interrupted them. Garwood's jaw tightened as he opened the door to reveal Christopher "Creepy" Howes lurking in the dimly lit hallway. The wiry informant hesitated, his darting eyes landing on Thaddeus. "I don't talk in front of kids," Creepy muttered, shifting uneasily. "Thaddeus," Garwood said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "wait in the hall." Thaddeus sprang to his feet. "I'm not leaving until you—" In an instant, Garwood grabbed the boy by the arm, his grip firm but not cruel, and pulled him toward the door. "Wait. In the hall," he growled, shoving Thaddeus out and shutting the door before he could protest further. Turning back to Creepy, Garwood motioned for him to speak. "You've got 5 minutes. Talk." Creepy shifted nervously, wringing his hands. His usual bravado was absent, replaced by a skittish energy that only heightened Garwood's unease. "Double the usual, Garwood. This one's big," Creepy said by way of an answer, his voice barely above a whisper. With an impatient sigh, Garwood pulled a $10 bill from his pocket and slapped it into Creepy's waiting hand. "Now." Creepy pocketed the money and leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I was at the Trail Queen earlier, rough crowd there tonight. Some railroad guys were talking about Hammer. He's using a shed on a railroad siding to gather what's left of Carlucci's gang. They're planning to move tonight." Creepy licked his lips, his gaze flicking to the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. He paused before continuing. "Something about taking the fight to the Irish and cleaning up anyone who doesn't fall in line." Garwood's mind raced. The Irish could only mean the Kelly brothers gang. Ronnie and Reggie Kelly were small-time operators compared to Carlucci, but they were ambitious and dangerous. Their botched, half-baked plan to use Carlucci's mistress as leverage had put Olivia in danger the year before. Garwood's stomach tightened. The Kelly brothers were reckless and ambitious, and their butcher shop, the cover for their operation, was the obvious target. If Hammer planned to make a statement, it would be loud and bloody. Creepy's voice pulled him back. You owe me, Garwood. That's good info. Garwood nodded curtly, pushing Creepy toward the door. Get out. Thaddeus, still lingering in the hallway, tried to push his way back inside. Garwood blocked him with a hand on his chest. Once the door closed, Garwood paced the room, his mind working through the implications. Thaddeus's pounding on the door barely registered at first, but the boy's muffled shouts eventually broke through his thoughts. Let me back in, Thaddeus demanded. You haven't finished telling me. Garwood ignored him, focusing instead on his next steps. The Kelly's butcher shop was their legitimate front and a likely target for Hammer's crew. If Garwood acted quickly, he could intercept the attack before the streets were soaked with blood. Garwood left the apartment, descending the stairs with purpose. Thaddeus scrambled after him, his voice rising in anger. You can't just leave me in the dark. I'll find her myself if I have to. Wait, Thaddeus called, following Garwood into the street. You can't just keep brushing me off. I deserve to know where she is. Garwood stopped so abruptly that Thaddeus ran into him. Turning sharply, Garwood fixed him with a glare. Not now, he said, his voice low and firm. When it's safe, I'll tell you everything. Until then, stay out of this. Thaddeus's face twisted with frustration. You're lying. You didn't send her to Cincinnati, did you? Not now, Garwood repeated, his voice low and fiery. When it's safe, when the time is right, I'll tell you everything. Until then, you need to trust me. Thaddeus shook his head, anger and frustration spilling over. You're lying to me. I'll find her myself if I have to. Garwood's jaw tightened. I'm sorry, Thaddeus, but right now I have bigger things to deal with. Go home. Without waiting for a response, Garwood turned and strode into the encroaching darkness, his long coat trailing behind him. Thaddeus stood frozen in the street, the weight of realization dawning on him. Garwood hadn't sent Olivia to Cincinnati. He was hiding her, and Thaddeus was determined to uncover the truth. The boy's fists clenched at his sides as he muttered under his breath, I'll find her, Garwood, no matter what. At the police station, Garwood quickly gathered Cosner and O'Malley. Ignoring their questions, he led them to Captain Eldridge's office, where the young captain sat with Marshal Hayes, the governor's investigator. Garwood laid out everything Creepy had told him, his voice steady but urgent. Hammer's targeting the Kellys. Their butcher shop is the most likely place for him to strike. What do you propose? Eldridge asked, his brow furrowed once Garwood had concluded. A counter-ambush, Garwood said. We stake out the shop, wait for Hammer and his men to make their move, and take them all down. Hammer, his gang, the Kellys. With the chaos of a turf war, they won't see us coming. Eldridge hesitated. We'll need more men. No, Hayes interjected, his grizzled voice cutting through the room. We don't know who we can trust. Keep it small, just us. Eldridge nodded reluctantly. Eldridge's hesitation was brief, but Garwood could see the weight of the decision in his eyes. Fine. Let's plan this carefully. As the 5 men began strategizing, Garwood felt the familiar weight of tension settle over him. The night ahead promised violence, but if they played their cards right, it could also bring them one step closer to cleaning up the city. At Garwood's apartment, Thaddeus knelt in the dim hallway, a pocket knife in his trembling hands. He worked at the lock, beads of sweat forming on his brow despite the cold. Guilt gnawed at him, but he shoved it aside. He had to find Olivia. He owed her that much. When the lock finally gave way, the door creaked open, and Thaddeus slipped inside, his heart pounding. Across the city, the home Olivia now shared with Garwood, Marie and Katie was silent, the warmth of the fire long since faded as the night deepened. Olivia sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the coarse fabric of her borrowed coat. Across the hall, she could hear Marie's soft breathing, the rhythmic sound signaling she had finally fallen asleep. Olivia's guilt and grief churned inside her, refusing to let her rest. The memories of her parents, Charles and Esther, haunted her every thought, their faces flashing behind her eyes every time she closed them. She couldn't ignore the pull any longer. She had to see them, to visit the place where they now lay. Pulling the coat tightly around her, Olivia tucked her golden hair beneath a dark scarf, and pulled a wide-brimmed hat low over her eyes. She had borrowed an old pair of Garwood's boots from the closet, and though they were far too big, she stuffed them with rags to make them passable. Her disguise wasn't perfect, but she hoped it would be enough to keep her unnoticed. Heart pounding, she slid the window open as quietly as she could, the freezing air biting at her skin. With one last glance toward Marie's door, she swung herself through the window and dropped to the ground below. The icy wind stung her face as she sprinted through the darkened streets, the boots slapping against the cobblestones. The city felt vast and hollow, the occasional flicker of gaslight casting long, lonely shadows. Her breath came in harsh, visible bursts as she ran, the cold stealing the air from her lungs, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't stop until she reached them. When she finally arrived at the cemetery, iron gates loomed tall and foreboding, their frost-covered bars glinting in the moonlight. Olivia slipped through the gap, her boots crunching against the frozen ground as she navigated the rows of gravestones. The sight of her parents' graves brought her to her knees. The names etched into the stone blurred as tears welled in her eyes. Mama. Papa. Her voice broke as she collapsed between the graves, the cold seeping through her coat and into her bones. She pressed her hands to the frozen earth, sobs racking her body as the weight of her guilt and trauma consumed her. I'm sorry, she whispered, her words trembling into the night. I'm so sorry. The wind howled around her, carrying her cries into the darkness as she curled into herself, her grief pouring out into the silent cemetery. Garwood and his 4 companions crouched behind a low brick wall near the Kelly brothers' butcher shop, their breath visible in the freezing air. Across the yard, a few cattle and pigs moved sluggishly, their breath steaming in the cold. The alley was eerily quiet, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Garwood's sharp eyes caught movement to the east, 10, maybe 12 men creeping toward the shop without lights. His chest tightened, and he gripped his revolver, signaling to the others. Eldridge adjusted his grip on his revolver, his jaw set with determination. We do this clean, he murmured, his voice steady. Hayes gave a curt nod, his weathered face unreadable. No hesitation. Cosner shifted slightly, his fingers brushing the butt of his pistol. Just like old times, he muttered under his breath, though his usual humor was absent. O'Malley's gaze was fixed on the alley, his years of experience evident in the calm way he positioned himself. Wait for it, he said quietly. Garwood's pulse quickened as the men in the alley grew closer. A mournful church bell in the distance began to toll, each echoing chime cutting through the silence like a warning. He tightened his grip on his revolver, his breaths measured and steady. Each chime of the bell felt like a countdown, the promise of bloodshed hanging heavy in the air. Garwood exchanged a glance with Cosner and O'Malley, their faces grim and determined. The 5 men tensed, knowing the moment of confrontation was at hand. Whatever the night had in store, it was about to begin. Garwood had been right. Blood would be spilled before the night was through. He could feel it in his bones, taste it in the icy January air. The city's blood-soaked power struggle was about to spill into the open once more.